everyone. Thanks for being here.
Hi.
So this is a presentation about photography, but I will not be showing any photographs today, at least not to your eyes. Instead, I will rely on image description to display some of the photos of anonymous blind people that I have found in the Wallach collection. The images will come to you through words, perhaps through your ears if you are a hearing person. Image description translates a visual object into a verbal object. As with all translations, something will be lost and something gained in the process. Seeing through language takes time. What is lost is the instantaneous look. What is gained is slow seeing. My concept of slow seeing was inspired by Susan Sontag's call for, quote, acts of criticism, which would supply a really accurate, sharp, loving description of the appearance of a work of art, as she wrote in her famous essay Against Interpretation. Image description is both a mode of access and of criticism. These two modes, access and criticism, are not mutually exclusive. And I hope to demonstrate today that they may even be dependent on one another. If given that loving attention, Sontag suggests, image description will reveal itself to be an aesthetic practice, an aesthetic of access. Try saying that 5 times fast. An aesthetic of access. And with that joyful concept hovering in the air, let's turn to our first photograph. A woman captured in stark black and white wears a sign, blind, in all caps. The painted sign is perhaps the size of a hand, but feels really big and loud. The white sign stands out against her black tunic, as does her pale, weathered face, itself accentuated by her black headscarf. Her right eye, the one closest to the camera, is half closed under a heavy lid. What can be seen of that eyeball is gray, perhaps obscured by a cataract. From that eye and her sign, we may infer her blindness. Blind woman's left eye is jammed into the corner, as if her attention is being grabbed by something to her left. Thanks to my several cited informants for their descriptions, and thanks to blind author Georgina Klieg for the term cited informant. You'll be hearing more from Georgina Klieg in a little bit. One of my cited informants thought blind woman's age indistinct. She could be 50, she could be 70. Another thought her coloring resembled their own, of Polish, German, and English descent. One saw in her face a touch of anger and longing. Another saw her expression as neutral. One noticed a metal brooch pinned to her collar with the number 2622, and that informant had to zoom way in to read the text around it. It says, licensed peddler, New York City. The shot is fairly tight from the bust up, and the background reveals only a masonry wall. At first glance, with all our biases in place, we might assume that this woman is begging on the street. However, the peddler's license proclaims her to be an official newspaper vendor, a not uncommon occupation for blind people throughout the 20th century. A blind friend still owns his stand near Times Square. According to the biographer Carolyn Burke, years after taking her portrait, Strand recalled the blind woman as one of those whom life had battered into some sort of extraordinary interest and, in a way, nobility. Strand's words suggest the common non-disabled assumption that a disabled person's existence is one of unmitigated suffering. In the heroism of vision, Sontag considers Strand's blind woman to be an example of, quote, the search for real faces generally sought among the anonymous, the poor, the socially defenseless, the aged, the insane, people indifferent to or powerless to protest the camera's aggressions. While it is true that those making a living on the street may not have the cushiest of lives, it is ableist to assume that disabled people's lives revolve around suffering simply because they are disabled. Many of our lives run counter to the usual stories about disability as only bad news, the curse everybody wants to avoid, writes Rosemary Garland Thompson in her introduction to About Us, an anthology of essays from the New York Times disability column. She continues, we do not necessarily understand our ways of being in the world as disadvantage, diminishment, or distress. Such a worldview can be difficult to grasp for people who understand themselves as non-disabled, because ours is a minority experience that the majority often find hard to imagine. Though Garland Thompson is here considering the non-disabled public generally, as a professor of literature, she is well aware of how these attitudes manifest in cultural productions and the criticism surrounding them. Critics and curators are not immune to the unconscious bias that is ableism. It seems to me that when museums, libraries, and other cultural institutions think about access, it is often from the standpoint of giving patrons a cultural experience. Inclusion is often perceived to be and constructed as a one-way street. For myself and other blind critics and scholars, access by way of image descriptions and other sensory translations, such as tactile representations, access leads to meaningful research and the unfolding critical attention, a blind critical gaze. In More Than Meets the Eye, What Blindness Brings to Art, Georgina Klieg writes, true access needs to be understood as something more than a one-sided act of generosity or charity. The presence of those formerly excluded people must be understood to invite a wholesale scrutiny of what the culture takes for granted about itself. She finishes by saying, blind people can bring a perspective that has not been articulated before. Considering the blind critical gaze means confronting anew such questions as, what perspectives have been silenced by inaccessibility? And what cultural losses accrue because of such critical and curatorial silences? With those heavy questions hanging in the air, let me take Blind Woman in a new direction, an avant-garde direction. Burke concludes her brief passage on Blind Woman with these words. Strand recalled that he took her portrait not so much in the spirit of social reform, but because she was the focus of a composition that filled the frame with energy. This photo was one of 12 New York City photos that Strand took in the fall of 1916, just after an intense period of research. According to Burke, it was his self-directed attempt to adapt Cubist techniques to his craft, turning a group of white porcelain bowls this way and that. He analyzed He analyzed their depths and surfaces, then photographed them as related shapes. But when he left his bowls to hit the streets of New York City, he found that the subjects were not so easily turned this way and that. So Strand famously used a prism camera to take Blind Woman's portrait and others in the series so that he could appear to be pointing his camera in one direction while taking a photo in another. That left his subjects unaware. So that begs the question of how much our blind woman could see of his presence, given that only about 10% of blind people have no sight at all. Chances are good that she had some vision in that open eye. Perhaps she even had macular degeneration, a fairly common disease of the retina that affects older adults, usually leaving them with no central vision. Now this is very similar to the kind of vision that I had when I was visually impaired. Now I am totally blind. And perhaps in sympathy, my right eye is tearing. I'm not crying, it's not you, it's me. Oh, I think it's the air conditioner, it's such a surprise. So I like this theory because it means that our blind woman might have been putting Strand into her usable peripheral vision as he put her into his camera's peripherally pointed focus. Blind Woman first appeared in Camera Work, a magazine of modern photography, and it was published by the photographer Alfred Stieglitz. The final 1917 double edition or double issue was dedicated to Strand's photos, and he wrote the opening essay. This ends with a rather prickly dismissal of those who disparage photography. He wrote, "Whether a watercolor is inferior to an oil, or whether a drawing, an etching, or a photograph is not as important as either is inconsequent. To have to despise something in order to respect something else is a sign of impotence. Let us rather accept joyfully and with gratitude everything through which the spirit of man seeks to an ever fuller and more intense self-realization." I love the appreciation of diversity implicit in the statement, as well as its lovely sentiment that suggests the visual arts are not just a matter of the eyes, but also, perhaps more importantly, a matter of the spirit. But of course, there is also his strong argument. It gives us the sense that photographers were constantly embattled with respect to photography's status as art. What is and what is not art leads me from the blind woman to the blind man. In April 1917, 2 months before the final issue of Camera Work, the first American Dada, or perhaps more precisely Proto-Dada, magazine was born. Published by Marcel Duchamp, Beatrice Wood, and Henri Pierre Rocher, the blind man's first cover featured an illustration by Alfred Frue, who would become a longtime cartoonist for the New Yorker. And in fact, just a shout out to NYPL, his archive is in the Billy Rose Theater division of NYPL. So Frue's illustration depicts a blind man wearing a top hat. He holds a walking stick in one hand and in the other a long leash attached to a dog that appears to be guiding him. They are walking past an abstract painting of a woman who is apparently thumbing her nose at him. The blind man seems at face value to represent the lay person who simply cannot see modern art, cannot, as the overused metaphor suggests, understand it. things become more complicated as we dive into the slim zine-like volume. On the first page, this declaration: the blind man will be the link between the pictures and the public, and even between the painters themselves. The painters themselves, that's the end. The personified blind man thus can act as a guide through the confusing world of modern art. What is missing, of course, is the actual blind person. But even so, the metaphorics of blindness serve my purpose here. He, the blind man, will give voice to the enlightening opinions that may spring up and make them known to all, as impartially as he can. Whatever be their tendencies, as long as they are interesting. And, this is the final proclamation of the blind man, he will give to lovers of art the pleasure of thinking aloud and hearing others do likewise. So the editors of The Blind Man suggest the vitality of voicing, speaking aloud, the confusions and contradictory opinions surrounding modern art. That invocation of disparate voices is what I'd like to put pressure on here. With this much bombast and pomp as the Dadas, I declare, image description revitalizes the visual in a world that is oversaturated with pictures. Image description and the critical blind gaze honors photography and visual art more generally with time. Something I think we all feel is in short supply these days. As a blind person with remembered sight, I find that good image descriptions develop a photo in my mind's eye the way it might in the darkroom. An eye, a nose, a head, a body, a setting, a sign. This is slow seeing, an unfolding of complexity through time and effort. As the blind man avers, when it comes to discussions of art, a multiplicity of voices has intrinsic merit. When we look silently with our eyes, we rob ourselves and the world of that chorus, that beautiful, discordant chorus. Translating the visual into the verbal offers new opportunities to discover how others see. Image descriptions are analogous to other literary forms that have commanded respect. Novel descriptions, poetic imagery, and, as Georgina Klieg pointed out to me recently, ekphrasis. That is to say that for thousands of years, poets have indulged in lavish descriptions of things like armor and shields. See Homer. Image description is literary, which is why I am baffled when author friends hand their books, their own books, to my sighted partner to describe. I want to shout, use your words! This brings me to the problem of timidity when it comes to image description. Perhaps the number one reason for this is that it's not easy to describe what you see. Yes, it takes time, but it's also hard to know where to begin. With the overall feel, with the style, with the subject, with the salient detail, the punctum, as Roland Barthes would have it. The punctum, he says, is this element that rises from the scene, shoots out of it like an arrow, and pierces the individual viewer in a very particular way. So you might choose to begin your description with the thing that pierces you. The punctum is personal. But seeing is always personal. When confronted with an image to describe, many fear doing it the wrong way, perhaps even seeing it the wrong way. Let's just nip that in the bud and say, The only wrong image description, you guessed it, is an absent image description. Pithy slogans aside, the fears, timidity, and reluctance to describe images is real. The problem has to do with misguided notions about objectivity. Absolute objectivity is neither possible nor desirable, as Klieg puts it. She calls for playful and informative approaches to verbal descriptions. Objectivity is not possible because we all bring our experience, biases, and affinities to bear when examining an image. Seeing doesn't just happen in the eyes, it happens in the mind. This brings me back to the spirit of the image, that which is paradoxically not seen or not immediately seen. The punctum may not reveal itself until the photograph is out of sight, as Barth puts it. Nothing surprising then if sometimes, despite its clarity, the punctum should be revealed only after the fact, when the photograph is no longer in front of me and I think back on it, he says. I may know a photograph I remember better than a photograph that I am looking at, as if direct vision oriented its language wrongly, engaging it in an effort of description which will always miss its point of effect, the punctum. Image description is indirect vision. As such, it can help us find more than what can be seen. As a blind person, perhaps ironically working with photographs, image description is both access to source material and the source material itself. I turn to several cited informants, human and AI, to describe each image. The image descriptions blossom into conversations and reveal the variety of human perception and expression. I want to turn for a moment to a specific kind of image description, and that is alt text. Image description is a widely used and generic term for translating the visual into the verbal. Alt text is a specific type of image description that embeds text into a digital image. This makes it accessible to blind people through text-to-speech software and braille displays. Alt text as poetry was created by blind artist Bojana Kukliat and disabled artist Finnegan Shannon. They created alt text as poetry to help people create and appreciate alt text. I highly recommend downloading their free workbook, or better yet, invite them to teach a workshop at your organization, as Wallach did last fall. Alt text as poetry is aesthetics of access in action. They urge alt text creators to push past dull ideas of compliance when they say, poetry has a lot to teach us about paring down language to create something that is expressive yet concise. Creating alt text for your personal images is a pretty low stakes way to practice your verbal description skills. Alt text is also an excellent way to produce metadata that can make images searchable. And that's why the Google search engine ranks websites that have alt text higher than those that don't. Alt text can also help to create the metadata that makes image catalog searches more robust. In that way, image descriptions are useful for all scholars by naming the stuff in the photos. This is predicated on the assumption, the acceptance even, that we may be wrong. We may be wrong when we name what we see. We will all sometimes get things wrong when it comes to the identity of the other, and we need to be okay with that, okay with making mistakes. If we are afraid to call a person blind or say that they appear blind, that is a kind of erasure. And it's born out of a certain amount of squeamishness in our culture surrounding disability. Now, I've encountered this kind of timidity or squeamishness in the descriptions generated by both humans and AI, because of course AI is educated by us. Metadata can be helped along by image descriptions, and the two things combined provide access. This access results in the possibility of a blind critical gaze. My search for blind people, anonymous blind people in the NYPL Prints and Photos online catalog began with the simple terms blind man and blind woman. Unfortunately, the Prints and Photos catalog, online catalog, has disappeared, closing that door on that crucial first entrance to research. There's no indication of when it will open, so if anybody knows, do let me know. There were 5 hits for blind woman, 29 for blind man. To demand that the portrait will be a complete portrait of any person is as futile as to demand that a motion picture be condensed into a single still, said Alfred Stieglitz regarding his extended photo portrait of Georgia O'Keeffe. That comprised hundreds of photos. I only have a single photo for each individual, a micro sliver of who they were. But in reading a few together, we might flesh out a more complete picture of blindness. What follows is one trail of associations in this photo portrait of anonymous blind people taken over the course of a century. I chose these particular photos for their blind signs. In The Heroism of Vision, Susan Sontag notes that what a photograph is of primary importance. If the subject of the photograph is visually ambiguous, we don't know how to react until we know what piece of the world it is. So the blind sign mitigates ambiguity. Lisette Model's 1937 photo, Blind Man, Paris, features a white man in his 60s or 70s wearing a sign around his neck. The printed sign boldly proclaims, again in all caps, the word aveugle, blind in French, followed by an odd little message. Thanks to my translator friend for deciphering and translating this message for me. It's rather worn and faded, so it appears that this sign has been working for this man for quite some time. I am the only one who can tell by touch the value and country of the coin that is entrusted to me. This strikes me as a boast or maybe a parlor trick, perhaps. Give me a coin from around the world and I can tell you by feel where it's from and what it's worth. Or is it also a warning? Do not try to fool me and give me some foreign coin in some tiny denomination. The man's clothes appear to have been good quality at one time, a straw hat, jacket, and vest, but are now ill-fitting and shabby. The soles of his shoes are peeling away. Now, I've spent a good portion of my life thinking and writing about the history of blind education, and so it feels particularly poignant to find this blind beggar in the city of the first school for the blind in the world. Vartan Gregorian, that's H-A-U umlaut Y, very strange French name, founded the Royal Institute for the Young Blind in Paris in 1785. He pioneered the use of embossed letters to teach his students how to read, do math, learn history and geography, etc., etc. And NYPL's Rare Books and Manuscripts division is home to a first edition, 1786 edition of Vartan Gregorian's essay sur l'éducation des aveugles, the essay on the education of the blind. And it laid out his pedagogical methods. It is actually currently on view in the Treasures exhibit, so you can check that out here. I think that's on the first floor, if I'm not mistaken. Does anybody know? Is the Treasures exhibit?
Yes.
First floor, yes, okay, great. In less than 40 years after the school opened, a young Louis Braille would enter that school, be educated using embossed Latin characters, and he would realize their limitations. They were cumbersome to read and almost impossible to write. So at the ripe old age of 16, Braille invented the raised dot system that we still use today. Turning to another photo, Walter Silver's blind pencil vendor, taken in 1950s New York City, features an older white man in a heavy coat sitting on the ledge of what appears to be a department store window. The man holds pencils in one hand and a sign written on the lid of the box that he's holding on his lap. Again, we have the word blind in big letters and in smaller print, please buy a pencil, thank you. Though we refer to him as a blind pencil vendor, one has the sense that this sign, we have the sense from the sign that there is no fixed price for these pencils and no change expected. The pencils seem to be a pretext for begging. Now that pretext was already old news when journalist, reformer Jacob Riis went into, he wrote How the Other Half Lives, which described, and that was in 1890, that described the extreme poverty of New York City tenements. This is what Riis said. The blind beggar alone is winked at in New York City streets because the authorities do not know what else to do with him. The annual pittance of $30 or $40, which he received from the city, serves to keep his landlord in good humor. For the rest, his misfortune and his thin disguise of selling pencils on the street must provide. Selling or begging, the blind sign may have evoked pity or ridicule, but it may also have served a practical purpose. For blind people moving through busy city streets, a blind sign told sighted people to watch out. Blind people have been using staffs and sticks at least as far back as literary and artistic representations show, but it was not until 1921 that a British photographer, blinded in World War I, hit upon the idea of painting the cane white. It makes sense that a photographer would recognize the importance of contrast. But it was not until after World War II that a training method for the use of a white cane began, and by sweeping it back and forth, and that many of these white canes were distributed. Thus, Strand's blind woman and Modell's blind man would not have had access to the white cane, and Silver's was perhaps unaware. Both the men, by the way, have wood canes, the kind usually used for weight bearing, rather than detecting obstacles and level changes. But of course, the white cane also performs another function, to signal blindness to the sighted public. I wonder if they would have needed their blind signs if they'd had those white canes. After I exhausted my searches in the catalog for the word blind, I tried blind adjacent terms such as Braille. And this led me to Tina Barney's 6 pigment prints, all titled Andrew Heiskell Braille and Talking Book Library. Andrew Heiskell is an NYPL branch library, specifically catering for the needs of blind patrons, but of course it is open to everyone. Barney's series, dated September 11th, 2019, features people reading and includes close-ups of books, Braille printouts, slates and styluses, Braille writers, and Braille displays. Our final portrait is of a black man wearing very dark glasses and a big button that reads, "I am deaf-blind," in all caps. David Lowe, a photo specialist, noted that his right hand with its index finger in a kind of relaxed pointing gesture unconsciously underlines that big button. Sadly, David couldn't be with us today, but his help navigating the photo collection and giving me frontline descriptions has been invaluable. Although wearing an identity badge feels anachronistic, there is something refreshing about this photo. The densely packed stack of Braille papers suggests that he is a power Braille reader. Now, as the previous photos are all street scenes, Barney's indoor scenes of literacy come as a relief. These blind and deafblind people are not just wearing signs, they are in a position to create them. Image descriptions, particularly of people who have been historically marginalized, can bear witness to our deep-seated biases and perhaps help to uproot them. I look forward to the day that I will search image databases for blind scientist, blind professor, blind mother, even, yes, blind photographer, and be rewarded with many, many images. I'm just going to, for a moment, to check how we're doing. Fantastic. Before I wrap up for today, I want to take you on one more journey of sensory translation. A few months ago, I thought that perhaps getting a blind woman under my fingers would offer some insight. So I took the digital image of Strand's photograph to the Dimensions Lab at the Andrew High School Library. And the Dimensions Lab is headed up by Chancey Fleet. By the way, I highly recommend her MIT article called "How Tactile Graphics Can End Image Poverty." The Dimensions Lab offers a mind-boggling array of accessible technology and training. So first, we printed out the image of blind woman on special paper that you feed into the Swellform graphics machine. It's like an easy bake oven, she told me. The carbon in the ink swells with the heat to raise the darkest parts the most. Her tunic, headscarf, and the word blind. My first tactile sight of blind woman was revelatory. My sighted informants had said that her sign was big, but the words cannot convey quite so viscerally as touch the stark hugeness of the word blind. In fact, the rest of the image using that method was a little bit blurry. Now, perhaps y'all will scold me for leaving the punctum reveal until the end, but there is something I have not yet mentioned about Blind Woman in the copy of camera work here at the library. Her image has doubled. In the more than 100 years since its publication, it is both the crisp black and white photo gravure that Stieglitz had carefully set into camera work, and it is also a ghostly reflection that the years pressed onto its facing page. One informant describes the phenomenon thus: blind woman's ghost image is pale rust on pale cream, clear but low contrast, lacking detail. Yet its softness and relative subtlety compete with the boldness of the printed image, drawing attention back and forth between the two. The tactile ghost image also lacks detail, yet it impressed upon me the mirror effect that doubles the word blind backwards with letters reversed. Since learning of Blind Woman, she has more than doubled. She suggests an infinitude of blind women stretching into the vanishing points, as happens when one stands between two mirrors. Each reflection contains another reflection, each story another story. We didn't have time that day to send Blind Woman to the 3D printer, as even a relatively small image takes hours for the layers to build up. But Chancey did produce one for me later. It's pretty cool. In case you're curious, come on up after the talk and you can feel Blind Woman for yourself. That first session, our next move was to send the image to the Braille multi-dot height printer. In addition to printing the neat rows of Braille cells for ordinary text, by varying the height and density of dots, the printer can create maps and other tactile graphics. Now, Braille printers tend to be very loud, and this one was no exception. Imagine for a moment a dozen toy soldiers firing machine gun pellets into cardstock, and you'll have some sense of the relentless rat-a-tat. Chancey and I eagerly felt the punctiform image emerge. Slow-seeing Blind Woman together. We had our hands on the emerging image, our fingers competing for the newest bits. In the relative quiet of a less dense patch of Braille fire, Chancey said, "So we may be the first blind people ever to have seen this image." A jolt of excitement thrilled along my spine. Goosebumps popped up on my skin. Here's another blind woman, I thought, and she's with me on this journey, this mission to wrest our representations from the exclusive grasp of the sighted gaze. "Yeah," I said, "we're probably the first to see Blind Woman, but we will not be the last." Thanks a lot, everyone. Well, I think we have a few minutes for some, yeah, we have about 10 minutes or so for questions, and I think Susanna's going to come around with the mic. Don't be shy, don't be shy. I'm going to take a sip of water. Oh, and please say your name when you are going to ask a question.
Hi, my name is Max. Thank you so much for this really great talk. I feel like you were sort of...
Is that you over there, or is that just the
That's
speaker
just the
that's over
speaker.
there? Okay. All right, got it.
projecting my voice.
Amazing. Yes, ventriloquism.
I think you were sort of alluding to this right at the end when you talked about the sighted gaze, but I'm really interested in this phrase, the critical blind gaze, and I would love if you could talk a little bit more about what you're doing with that phrase specifically, how it sort of, I don't know, speaking back, I'm thinking of, you know, all the criticisms of things like the male gaze or Rosemary Garland Thompson writing about staring.
Yes.
So if you wouldn't mind talking a little bit more about specifically this phrase, critical blind gaze, I would love to hear that. Thank you.
Oh my goodness, thank you. It's an amazing question. I mean, in some ways, that was my talk. What I can say more about this is exactly right. It's connected up with other attempts and successes in kind of taking over a gaze. And of course, when we're talking about a critical gaze, it means something that's really going to multiply in our cultural imagination. And so specifically for blindness, I am, in this project, it started with this idea of looking at anonymous blind people, but ideally we're going to move beyond just looking at images of ourselves to think about larger questions of cultural production, right? And the something that I talk about a lot in my book, Their Plant Eyes, A Personal and Cultural History of Blindness, out by Pantheon in 2021. I I have some postcards up here if you want them. But I talk a lot about ocular centrism, and I didn't talk about that so much in this talk. But of course, the idea there is that it's kind of a flavor of ableism, right? Assuming that cited ways of doing things are sort of the only, or at least the best ways of doing things, and it presupposes the idea that I guess site-oriented productions of culture are also the most important. So even though I'm kind of looking at the blind critical gaze in the most obvious sense in this talk about, you know, pictures of blind people that need to be kind of looked at from the blind critical gaze perspective, I think it can open out into a lot of larger talks about what we think of as art. And I could just go on and on. But
Thank you, Dr. Godin. This has just been wonderful. My name is Joel Snyder, and I've been working with
I know your name.
thank you. Audio description for over 40 years now. I pioneered the technique with others in Washington, D.C. for live theater, and came up from Washington just to listen to you.
Amazing.
And I'm so glad that I
Thank
did,
you, Joel,
because
for
you're
being here.
a couple of comments and then a question. Your references to translation were so apt. My own PhD is in audiovisual translation, which is studied throughout Europe as a form of, you know, subtitling, dubbing, and they embraced audio description about 15 years ago when I did a seminar with the professors that run those programs. So that idea of translation is important, I think, and your concept of the visual made verbal. That's the title of my book, actually.
Amazing.
So,
when is that out? Or is that out?
It's out 2014 by the American Council of the Blind.
All right.
The second edition. The second edition is coming this year. But the question I had was with respect to objectivity, and it's so wonderful that you're here, and I got a chance to meet you, and Georgina Klieg is here as well.
Yay, Georgina.
Who I've known for a number of years. The idea of objectivity, I think that gets maybe overemphasized, misunderstood. It's something that I teach when I train describers around the world. I fervently believe in the quote from Anais Nin: "We don't see things as they are, we see them as we are." That's just true. We are subjective human beings. But to my way of thinking, and what came from Dr. Margaret Van Steel, the blind woman that crafted audio description with me and several others in '81, is the notion that description should show and not tell. If you have a scene with the ground cover of leaves, why tell people it's fall or autumn? Show them by describing brown curled leaves, that sort of thing. If you have a person who is tearing up and crying, I think you'd be wrong to call them sad, because they might very well have won the New York lottery this morning. And that's my only point with respect to objectivity. I understand that we are not objective human beings, but I wonder if you could speak to that a little bit, or Georgina.
Yeah. Well, you know, that reminds me actually of, I think it's Georgina who talks about this. Actually, there's a film that's coming around called Possibilities, but it makes me think of from AFB, and she mentions the fact that, you know, she's heard it described in a film that somebody turned the corners of their mouth up instead of leaping to the conclusion of a smile. But you know, I think that, but I think that it's possible, right, that actually does suggest something too, right? And I think that this is where the artistry of all of this comes in, right? I think that there's a moment for saying crackling leaves or turning the corners of one's mouth up. And there's also a moment there's also the opportunity to say, it's a crisp fall day in Central Park, right? That might be sort of an opening. It speaks to, say, the difference between one of those, what do they call, establishing shots in film, right? Where you might want the bigger words, you know? And then you might get into the granular, the micro descriptions, especially if we're involved in a movie that is taking a lot of artistic not liberties, but moving in an artistic direction, right? Because I think that one thing that perhaps you're getting at, and all of us are getting at, is that the description should do its best to not just, as you say, tell us about what's going on, but give us the feel of what's going on. And so, of course, image descriptions and audio description are not going to be the same for a documentary about World War II as they're going to be from some art house film, right? I mean, they just can't be the same, and I mean that's where the artistry of translation comes in, right? That's even though of course translators are still trying to get their own appreciation. I remember I have a friend who actually did the translation for my French, and one time somebody at a cocktail party came up to her and was like, "Oh, you must work so hard on your translations. It must be such a long and involved process." And Esther was like, "Yes, it is." And she said, "What does it take you, like 2 weeks to do a novel?" So getting respect for translation is still a long way. So we've kind of got a double battle here to fight. But yes, I mean, I agree with you completely. And again, I think that we would all agree that it depends on what we're talking about, and to be as true to the thing that we're looking at as possible, and to allow for the beauty of an attempt of objectivity, right? Because even objectivity, that naive gaze, has an aesthetic quality to it, right? I mean, there are plenty of novels that have come to us with that, that naive perspective that is itself a kind of an aesthetic approach, for sure.
That's great. Thank you.
Oh, thank you for being here, Joel. Thank you. I hope we get a chance to chit-chat later. Okay, good. I think we have time for one more. Susanna, what do you say? You're
Yes, one more.
keeper of time? Yes, one more. If there is.
Yes.
Yes.
Hi, Leona. It's Finnegan.
Finnegan, I thought I heard you laughing. Lots of friends here. Amazing.
I know that
Finnegan, just for those who don't know, is one of the creators of alt text as poetry.
Thank you.
Woo-hoo! Yeah, we got
Shout
stars. We got stars in the crowd today. Amazing.
Well, yeah, learned so much from you, from Georgina, and many other thinkers. I know that you talked a little bit about AI, and I know that you've
Yes.
you've had some. I know from talking to Bojana that in the past the AI descriptions have been really, really bad, but that recently there's an emergence of kind of okay sometimes, or AI descriptions that are interesting to kind of have in the conversation, as you were kind of talking about in terms of cited informants that are both human and AI, and I just wanted to I wanted to hear more about how you are using AI in your research and how you've experienced that change, and just what that tool has been like for you.
Thank you for that question. My bad for not giving y'all an example of that. That would be like a whole nother talk, because I have to say that these days AI description is amazing. It's amazing. It is, I dare say it is game changing, and I'll tell you why, for two reasons. One, its ability to give detailed descriptions of an image almost instantaneously is quite astounding. I think pretty much all of my blind friends that I've talked with have been like, wow, that is a huge improvement over some previous forms that I think were more about people behind the scenes kind of training them to learn something, whereas now it's getting access to all of what's on the internet, which is a lot. And so, but there's a few reasons why it's both interesting and exciting and very much ready for another big conversation, because, okay, I'll give you one example, which is that it can unlock that timidity in humans that I talk about. I'm sorry for calling you out, my darling Alabaster, who's my partner, who's filming today, but he's also a visual artist, and sometimes his images, his illustrations are very complex. And so one time I just took one of his images and I stuck it through It's actually called Be My AI, is the specific iteration of AI image description that is very accessible to blind people. And it gave this lavish, amazing description of his artwork. It was not right. It made a lot of mistakes. But to be staring at, and this is true if any of you are creative people, which I get the feeling a lot of y'all are, writers or whatever, it kind of dispels that blank page syndrome, right, of what I was talking about being afraid to enter into the image. If you're faced with like a lavish description from Be My AI, it's a lot easier to correct than to start from scratch, especially when you're not used to it. So, I mean, just like I hope AI will do for many of the things in our lives, it will be something that we will have a conversation with. And I tell you what, that's the amazing thing about Be My AI, is that I don't just get a description and then I'm done with it. I can ask questions. And so I can say, are you sure? Especially if I know something, are you sure that is the way it is? And I gotta tell you, AI deals with being corrected a lot better than most humans. And I know we are running up against time, so I'm gonna end with that right there. It's a 3:01. And yes, further discussion about AI, because lots to say. But my goodness, thank you so much, and thanks to the Vartan Gregorian Center for Humanities, and Aiden, and Suzanne, and everybody behind the scenes here. And thank you all for being here. I hope we can figure out some place to all go and have a chit chat and have some coffee or something. So I'm open to suggestions. Oh, and if you want to feel my blind woman, come on. Thank you.